As internet discourse increases over whether or not a parent is entitled to post their children's lives on social media, financial gain expected or not, it beckons the question, when did this all start? Social media has only really existed and captivated the culture for about 20 or so years. And are we really trying to suggest that social media has been the only chosen avenue for exploitative parents? Or that the phenomenon has only existed due to the presence of social media? That thought's almost laughable because of this new influx of child star documentaries hitting streaming services like Brooke Shields' documentary Pretty Baby on Hulu, which highlighted the exploitative business practices facilitated by her mother. Not to mention literally all of Judy Garland's life, Shirley Temple's childhood, Drew Barrymore's childhood. But I will raise the point that all the aforementioned examples all willingly participated in the film and television industry, whereas many children now shown on social media through their parents' account or family blog channels do not have that same luxury. So, diving further into what exactly I am trying to answer within this video, it's what can be argued as the first case of a child unable to consent that was exposed to the world through their parents' control, and what were the repercussions of that? More importantly, how has it affected the culture since, and what can we learn from the past? The case of the Lindbergh baby, in my humble opinion, parallels many of the contexts of children on social media today, especially those who appear on popular family channels on platforms like YouTube and TikTok. Occurring in the early 1930s, this case culturally and legally changed America and the world. If this makes any sense, it had a bigger impact on the country compared to infamous cases like John Benet Ramsey or Patty Hearst. While those cases are specifically horrible in their own reasons, the children were relatively unknown before the crimes occurred. However, Charles A. Lindbergh had been famous worldwide since his first breath. Newspapers of the time proudly displayed the infant child on the front page. While this case has become a cultural zeitgeist on its own, personally I found out about it through the 1960s movie Murder on the Orient Express. I am aware that the actual cultural impact of the case has ultimately been lost throughout time. To properly understand the cultural importance of this case, we have to explore the historical context of the time. This is early 1930s in America. We're fresh in a Great Depression. Another world war is creeping around the corner. In general, the girls are not doing well. Also, and this may seem a bit random, but I promise you it is so important to this case that you're going to scream. Criminal forensics is new. So new it's hardly a thing at all. Not to mention, birth certificates are hardly a custom at this time. The first standardized birth certificate was established in 1908. It's a bit random, but I really want to establish that we did not have a firmly standardized method of accounting for children, and this is due to immigration, child labor practices, and illegal adoptions of the time. Missing children were just kind of a thing at this point. Thousands of children were disappearing without any news coverage because, well, it's 1930s America. Now, the Lindbergh baby deviates from the norm from his conception since his parents were two socialites that were loved around the world, extremely wealthy, and not to mention two hotties. His father, Charles Lindbergh, was a famous pilot and the first person to complete a nonstop flight from New York to Paris. His mother, and Mara Lindbergh, was the daughter of a U.S. ambassador, writer, and a pilot as well. Now, these two were kind of the it couple in the news at the time. The public loved these girlies and wanted to know more about their lives. And now we know that it's the Great Depression, but isn't it kind of fun that people of a similar financially chaotic time were also interested in celebrity couples while struggling to survive? I guess the sausage and beer argument remains as solid as ever. Quoting from a newspaper at the time, quote, "The world's most famous honeymooners aboard their trim love bark, the swift cruiser Molette, were knifing the spindrift of the lower end of the Cape this afternoon." Newspapers were flooded with the news of the couple's surprise wedding at Anne's family home. Reporters jumped at the chance to catch the honeymooners. Quote, they had disappeared after their surprise wedding in the home of the bride's parents, Ambassador and Mrs. Dwight W. Morrow, carried late yesterday, and taking the lone trail of the sea, air, or highways had eluded the hunters of the press in public. Reports had them at many points in New Jersey or New England, but too early for noon. Confirmed word of their honeymoon quarters was lacking. Many theorized they had sought refuge on a yacht. Others argued the couple must be on an air honeymoon, while still others felt the Lindberghs had turned to the open trails in an automobile. A veritable reporter's army and a throng of curious people had nothing to whet their curiosity besides reports of the weather and a crop of unverified rumors. End quote. Plenty of articles were written about rumors of where the couple went to honeymoon, and while the excitement for the couple continued, nothing would compare to the announcement of the birth of their son. Barely a year after the famous wedding of the Lindbergh couple, the birth of their son was announced. And I want to add that Anne and Charles were actually young parents. Anne had just turned 24 years old, and Charles was a cool 30 years old. As you can imagine, news of the birth of the little boy was everywhere. Newspapers around the world proudly displayed headlines informing the public about the birth. Reporters flocked to their remote home in New Jersey to receive information about the newborn. Here are some quotes from newspapers at the time. Quote, the baby boy weighing 7 pounds and 13 ounces arrived just before 3:30 o'clock this afternoon. The first public announcement, made by a close friend of the ambassador and Mrs. Dwight W. Morrow, stated that the mother and the baby were doing nicely, end quote. Another quote reads, the Lindbergh baby's birth certificate was filed with the Department of Health today, but the world will have to keep calling it just the Lindbergh baby for a while. The certificate stated the baby was a boy and that it was born at 1:15 on June 22nd. That the father was Charles A. Lindbergh and the mother Anne Mara Lindbergh, and that the home of both parents is in St. Louis. Another quote reads, born under the air sign Libra, with the sun in the sign Cancer, zodiological findings reveal in him a great attachment to home life and domestic consideration, but those qualities will in no way prevent him from following in his father's path in the air, for he also has a pronounced leaning towards aviation, end quote. So looking back with a modern perspective of the importance of privacy and security, it's almost mind-blowing to think that a baby in 1932 was pretty much doxxed due to the celebrity status of his parents. In comparison, look at how the world treats children of the Kardashians, where the pregnancies are hidden from the world and the names of most of the children are hidden for much longer, let alone announcing the weight and birth time of the children hours after they were born. I guess we could blame this phenomenon on the merging of the public and private sphere due to social media that has placed even more importance on privacy for major celebrities. However, it is interesting that a non-social media culture reflects a similar celebrity-obsessed culture as the contemporary day. Honestly, you can almost make the case that the public has more respect for a celebrity's privacy more than ever now. We aren't flocking to people's houses when it's announced that they gave birth due to security measures now set in place for celebrities. Anyways, the Lindberghs were sort of trailblazers when it came to celebrities trying to keep their children private, choosing not to disclose his name for a while after his birth, prompting newspapers to begin the guessing game of the child's name and which parent he favors in looks. Quote, a member of the household of Colonel and Mrs. Lindbergh said today that it had definitely decided that the Lindbergh heir's first name would be Charles. As to a middle name, it said that the family had not decided whether to call the child Charles Dwight or Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. End quote. The kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby would happen on March 2nd, 1932. Reporters quickly surrounded the Lindbergh estate to get the scoop, while the police force began a comprehensive search of the house and the wooded areas that surrounded the home. Detectives began to cross-reference the kidnapping with criminals charged with the crime, hoping to figure out what kind of person had snatched the baby. Quote, "No sane criminal would have attempted this particular kidnapping for profit. The inevitable publicity and the extent of the search would make it impossible to cash in on the crime. That some weak-minded and unprofessional criminal type kidnapped him without considering the difficulties of making money by the crime." End quote. Detectives would attempt to predict the profession of the kidnapper through the footprints left behind. Quote, "They thought that they were committing the perfect crime. They took every precaution to leave no trace, and when they realized footprints were inevitable, they removed their shoes. But with all the precautions they committed one grave tactical error, which is very likely to cost them their freedom. They carried the ladder to the house. There is a vast difference between an amateur ladder carrier, so to speak, and a professional, and the footprints left in the Lindbergh lawn will tell the story. If the kidnapper is a laborer accustomed to working with ladders, a painter, a carpenter, or someone like that, his footprints will be in a straight line. If he is unused to putting up ladders, the footprints will show distinct signs of wavering." End quote. The attempt to study the footprints of the kidnappers to determine their professions can be seen as an offshoot from the attempt to recognize patterns in people of certain professions. The detectives believe that a straight line of footprints can indicate what profession a person may have some possibility. However, it cannot be a definite in its prediction. Who was to say that the kidnapper had used a ladder a lot to fix their own home and had been used to the activity? Or could the kidnappers practice with the ladder to possibly fool detectives? The previous stated questions may seem ridiculous, but they do not differ from the belief that how someone carries a ladder can determine the career that they might have. Quote, "In the kidnapping, a baby, an entirely different procedure is necessary. How a criminal can enter a house, the child is frequently put to sleep early, perhaps even before electrolytes are necessary, so the kidnapper must learn in some other way the location of the room. Even more important, he must know the layout of the rest of the house and the habits of the occupants to determine what time would be the best for success. In the case of a child such as the Lindbergh heir, the situation is further complicated by a nurse who was in almost constant attendance. A Confederate familiar with the household routine thus becomes an absolute necessity. With these two red herring-proof clues, the chase is off to a good start." End quote. The detectives of the case were using forensic surveillance to understand how they could have committed this crime. However, without advanced technology available to consider what profession the person may have kept, the police from accurately assuming what kind of individual could have done this. So during this time in American history, the theory of eugenics was actually pretty popular. I know that we commonly associate that with Nazis of the time, but actually before that, America was very big into eugenics. Popular belief actually became that the kidnappers were weak-minded, supporting the belief of the time that some people may be able to hide their mental capacity of 11 or 12 and blend into society. Quote, "The Lindbergh baby may be in the hands of a band of illiterate, diseased, and lawless denizens of the cranberry bogs of New Jersey. The Pineys live by the cranberry picking, stealing, and assorted minor criminalities. They are illiterate and suffer from mental illness." End quote. The attempt to place the kidnappers as weak-minded people would explain the hastiness in which the crime was committed, but failed to explain how they could successfully plan and kidnap the Lindbergh baby. While the belief that illiterate folks kidnapped the Lindbergh baby may have soothed some from the fear that their child may be kidnapped, it casted a negative light on police forces who were failing to use forensic technologies available to them. Fingerprinting technology was available, but the practice was still in its rudimentary form. Smudged fingerprints made it impossible to use, even though the police had actually found the note, ladder, and muddy windowsill that had fingerprints of the kidnapper all over. Quote, The card was taken to the Newark police headquarters, where it was photostated and scrutinized by fingerprint experts. Kelly is the fingerprint expert attached to the Morristown police force. He declined to tell reporters if he had found anything of value, but a shake of his head to a superior officer was interpreted as indicating that his investigation had been fruitless. End quote. So there was actually great legislative change in the country because of this case. Blocking state borders and searching highways for a green sedan became a pivotal approach to finding the Lindbergh baby. There had been 2 sightings of the automobile by the Lindbergh estate, and the occupants in the car had asked 2 separate people for directions to the home. Quote, Julius Goldberg, a commission merchant, notified police today that he had seen an automobile carrying 3 men and a crying baby on Highway number 24 between this city and Newark last night. The police here put a request on the teletype after a large sedan bearing 3 men and what the police thought may have been the baby was seen by a resident of Manlius to pass along the road to Syracuse. End quote. The possibility of passing through state borders with the baby caused the federal government to begin passing legislation over the punishment for kidnapping and leaving the state to hold a much higher penalty. Many even voiced that the kidnapper should be given the electric chair. Quote, electrocution should be the least punishment for the persons kidnapping the infant son of Mr. and Mrs. Charles A. Lindbergh, as Governor W.H. Murray of Oklahoma sees it. I don't know what the penalty is in Oklahoma for that crime, but I do know what we would get them, and they would pay, and pay dearly. End quote. Even Al Capone had commented on the case and how he believed that the kidnapper could be caught by his own mafia network. Quote, I know how Mrs. Capone and I would feel if our son was kidnapped, and I sympathize with the Lindberghs. If I were out of jail, I could be of real assistance. I have friends all over the country who could aid in running this thing down. End quote. The increasing distance of where the baby and kidnappers may have gone inspired extensive searches and comments on the penalties for kidnapping, bringing out even high-profile criminals like Al Capone to help on the search. Unfortunately, with all the attention, money, and manpower that was set on finding the Lindbergh baby, it's believed that he was found dead months after the crime. William Allen, an African-American man, found the corpse of the Lindbergh baby in Hopewell, New Jersey on May 12, 1932. Reporting his findings to the police, Allen interviewed with papers about the story and was given a contract actually with a circus to retell the story of finding the Lindbergh baby's corpse. Quote, the baby was about 45 feet back from the road. He did not want no reward for finding the baby. He just wanted to keep his job. End quote. Although the case had been closed, the echoes of its effect on legislation and police work remains in the culture today. The legislation for taking a kidnapped child over state borders remains. The use of spreading photographs of missing children continues on. Using card descriptions to warn civilians to be on the lookout is still in practice through Amber Alerts. So what can we learn and what did we learn from the Lindbergh baby case? Obviously, we increased legislation on kidnapping cases and, thankfully, set aside eugenics after World War II. However, we still have a similar situation when it comes to infant children and celebrity children. I mean, many people follow the Kardashian children currently on platforms like TikTok, and family channels are very popular on YouTube. Oftentimes, these people have their locations known by showing the front of their homes or even their backyards, which ultimately puts them up as a risk for a creep to find their location and possibly repeat the Lindbergh baby case. Obviously, nobody wants that, which is why there's an increased call to stop putting children on social media, to stop family vlogging channels. And I think that this case shows why that's necessary and why it's important to understand why you cannot give details about your child without their consent. It oftentimes leads them into a dangerous situation. And like the Lindbergh baby, it can sometimes unfortunately end up resulting in death, which nobody wants for a child. So ultimately, we need to look at our historical past and realize what changes we can make to make our children safer and our contemporary world better.